Ms. Machalek, thank you for joining us today. The first question I have for you, how would you generally assess the 2013 Armenian presidential elections?
Well, the elections can be assessed as having gone peacefully, having been conducted in a relatively smooth way, but they do not represent a forward step in terms of a more democratic electoral environment or really testing the current government's commitment to democratic standards.
So after the elections, the main opposition leader, Rafi Hovhannisyan, who got 37% turnout, does not accept the official results of the elections. Do you think there are any possibilities of any kind of, what would be the development of this until the inauguration day, which is April 9th?
Well, it's not an uncommon event that an opposition leader denies the legitimacy of the results in an election in Armenia. Any Armenian will attest to that. And I think that the claims that the election was unfair in some respects, I mean, the ruling party engaged in an abuse of administrative resources like it commonly has done in the past to control the vote. It's also, there were many cases of pressure on voters and so on. So there is legitimacy to the claims that the election results are questionable. But given the fact that the complaints and appeals procedure doesn't allow for a lot of complaints to actually go through the process, it doesn't allow voters, it doesn't allow observers to submit complaints. It only allows candidates and proxies of candidates, and most of those claims have been discounted. I don't think that there will be any results of these protests to overturn the results. I think it's pretty sure that the current president will be inaugurated and will continue to run Armenia for the next 5 years.
Thank you very much. And so the President Barack Obama congratulated Sir Sarkisian with his re-election. Considering the current situation in Armenia, do you think it was a false start by Obama?
Not necessarily. The monitoring of an election, the judging of the democratic standards of the election is a very complex task. And you cannot, it's hard to judge if there's a lot of pressure being put on voters beforehand to make certain decisions at the polling stations, or the non-competitiveness of the electoral environment. These are all factors that set up the election to already be in the favor of the incumbent president before it begins. So that's not to say that he didn't really get 58% of the vote. So for President Obama to not congratulate him, I think that would be a pretty extreme standpoint, given the fact that elections prior to this were not any more. I wouldn't say they were any worse or any better. Some of them were worse, but it would be a kind of a reactionary move in a situation where you don't have a very outstanding election. I mean, this election is pretty commonplace. That the events that took place in this election are pretty much a standard procedure that's been going on in Armenia for a while now, with the exception of maybe the violence that happened in 2008. But it would be a pretty extreme move for Obama to not congratulate the president.
Okay, after this, then the next question would be probably, what should be the role of the United States and international community, whether they're NGOs or government, in trying to settle the post-election political crisis in Armenia?
I think that they should support the processing of claims and of complaints about violations. They should support these cases being taken seriously. For example, the police, they started 300 investigations into electoral violations, and only ended up initiating 10 cases out of those, and those will probably go nowhere. So they can insist on taking these complaints seriously and really checking back with them and following up on how that's going. Another thing that they can do is they can push the current president Sarkisyan to really improve the environment in the next five years, so that when he is no longer eligible for re-election, that we can finally have a fairer playing field. They can push him to stand up to democratic ideals with solving the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, with holding up to sanctions against Iran and trying to maneuver around Armenia's dependence on Iran, or their relations with Iran for energy and so on. The U.S. and the Western governments can do a lot to insist that Armenia uphold its allegiance to democratic ideals. But in terms of resolving this election, I don't see a lot of promise for them turning around the results.
Okay, thank you very much. And one last question. Do you think there can be any unpredictable sort of turnouts if these protests continue for a while?
The current government was very careful in this election to make sure that the events of 2008 and after the elections in 2008, that those were not repeated, that there was no violence, that media coverage of the protest was light and didn't focus on criticism of the current government, and to try to really contain anger about what was going on, because having a repeat of the violence, of the deaths, of the arrests of political dissidents, this they did not want to repeat, because they got a lot of flack for that from the international community. So I would say that if the protests continue to escalate in Armenia, it will really be a test for the current authorities, for the current administration, at how much they're willing to refrain from engaging in violence, to refrain from cracking down on these protests. And it could go either way. These protests could, because of pressure from the international community, they could maybe get the government into a position of negotiation over taking complaints against electoral violations seriously, for example, or maybe a recount in certain situations. Or they could escalate into violence, and hopefully it wouldn't be the latter. I'd like to hope that the government learned its lesson from the results of the 2008 election, that only puts them in a bad standing internationally by engaging in such practices, and hopefully they will avoid that.
And if they, let's say, do you think that international community would be a little more active this time? Hypothetically.
Hypothetically. Well, I mean, we can always hope that they would be. Unfortunately, Armenia is not high on the radar of many international governments, foreign governments. This is because of its geopolitical standing. It's not an energy state. It's not on the border of the European Union like Ukraine is, for example. It's not seen as a bastion of democracy, that the only hope for the region, like Georgia, for example. Armenia is in a tough situation because it has to sort of fight to get attention from the international community, and unfortunately it usually only gets this attention when there is violence and there are deaths. And hopefully the international community and foreign governments would remember the events of 2008 and would step in or make some stern warnings or comments to avoid such a situation. I can only say that international NGOs, organizations such as Freedom House, where I work, we try to raise these types of situations on the radar of our leaders so that these types of events don't repeat themselves. But as I said, it's a challenge, since Armenia is unfortunately not on the high profile of economic radars, energy radars, and that's a challenge to really trying to uphold human rights and democratic standards in this region, in this country.